I watched my 7-year-old daughter drag her twisted leg across the living room floor, her small face white with pain, while my mother sat on the couch scrolling through her phone like nothing was happening. The bone in Zara's shin was clearly broken. I could see the unnatural angle even through her jeans, but when I begged them to help me get her to the hospital, my father just shook his head and said she was being dramatic. My brother Marcus actually laughed when Zara whimpered, telling her to walk it off like he used to when we were kids. The sound of her bare foot scraping against the hardwood as she tried to stand will haunt me forever. That's when I realized my own family would rather watch my child suffer than admit they might be wrong about anything. My name is Celeste, and before that day, I genuinely believed family meant everything. I worked as a pediatric physical therapist at Children's Medical Center, spending my days helping kids recover from injuries and teaching parents how to spot the signs of serious trauma. The irony wasn't lost on me later. Every morning, I'd arrive at the hospital by 7, my scrubs pressed, my hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail I'd worn since nursing school. The smell of antiseptic and the sound of children laughing during their therapy sessions had become my normal. At home, I lived in the same neighborhood where I grew up, just 3 blocks from my parents' house on Maple Street. Zara and I had moved back after my divorce 2 years earlier, and I thought having family close by was a blessing. My daughter would spend afternoons at my parents' house after school while I finished my shift. She'd do homework at their kitchen table, the same one where I used to eat breakfast before school 25 years ago. My mother would make her snacks, and my father would help with math problems. Marcus still lived there too, between jobs and relationships, but he was good with Zara. Or so I thought. The house smelled like my childhood, coffee grounds and vanilla candles, with that faint mustiness that old carpet holds. Family photos lined the hallway, generations of smiling faces that made me feel rooted, secure. I had built my entire adult life around the assumption that blood meant loyalty, that family would always choose love over pride. I was completely, devastatingly wrong. If this story hits home, make sure you're subscribed. We tell these stories for a reason. The cracks had been showing for months, but I kept painting over them with excuses. My parents had always been stubborn, set in their old-school ways, but lately their stubbornness had turned mean. When Zara scraped her knee badly at the playground and I wanted to take her for stitches, my mother rolled her eyes and said I was raising her to be weak. When Zara complained of stomach pain that turned out to be a mild appendix inflammation, my father insisted I was wasting money on doctors for every little thing. The pattern was always the same. They'd dismiss my concerns, then act like I was the problem for being worried. Marcus would back them up with that smirk I remembered from childhood, the one that said I was being ridiculous. During family dinners, they'd make jokes about helicopter parenting while Zara sat right there, learning that her pain didn't matter to the people who were supposed to protect her. But the day that changed everything started like any other Saturday. Zara had been playing in their backyard, climbing the old oak tree that Marcus and I used to scale when we were kids. The branch she grabbed was rotten. I could see that from the kitchen window the moment before it snapped. The crack echoed across the yard like a gunshot, followed immediately by Zara's scream. I ran outside to find her crumpled at the base of the tree, her left leg bent at an angle that made my stomach drop. As a physical therapist, I knew exactly what I was looking at. The fibula was definitely fractured, possibly the tibia too. She needed x-rays, pain medication, and a cast. She needed medical attention immediately. But when I scooped her up and carried her inside, begging my parents to help me get her to the ER, they just stared at me like I was overreacting to a scraped knee. The dismissal in their eyes wasn't just frustrating, it was cruel. And in that moment, watching my daughter suffer while my own family sat unmoved, something fundamental shifted inside me. My father looked up from his newspaper with that familiar expression of annoyed patience, the same look he used to give me when I'd wake him up with nightmares as a child. He's probably just bruised, Celeste. Kids bounce back from everything. My mother didn't even glance away from her phone screen, scrolling through Facebook like my daughter's sobs were background noise. I knelt beside Zara on the living room carpet, trying to examine her leg without moving it too much. The swelling was already starting, and when I gently touched the area just below her knee, She let out a cry that should have moved mountains. Instead, Marcus walked over, looked down at us, and actually chuckled. "Come on, Z," he said, using his nickname for her. "Remember when Uncle Marcus broke his arm falling off his bike? I didn't cry like that. You're tougher than this." The casual cruelty of it hit me like ice water. This wasn't just stubbornness or old-fashioned thinking. This was my family choosing their own pride over my daughter's well-being. They would rather maintain their position that I was an overprotective mother than admit a 7-year-old needed medical care for a clearly broken bone. I tried reasoning with them, explaining what I could see as a medical professional. The way her foot was positioned, the immediate swelling, the sharp pain when I barely touched the area, these weren't symptoms of a bruise. But my father just folded his newspaper with that sharp snap that meant the conversation was over. "Your job has made you paranoid," he said. "She needs to learn that crying doesn't solve everything." That's when something inside me went very, very quiet. Not angry yet, just cold. I looked around that living room, at the family photos on the mantel showing 4 generations of our supposedly close-knit clan, at the religious plaques about love and compassion hanging on the walls, at these people who had raised me to believe that family came first above all else. And I realized I was raising my daughter among strangers who happened to share my DNA. The heat that rose in my chest wasn't rage, it was clarity. Crystal clear understanding that I had been playing by rules that only applied to me. They expected my loyalty, my deference, my willingness to doubt myself before questioning them. But they felt no obligation to protect what mattered most to me. I carried Zara to my car alone. She whimpered with every step, her small hand gripping my shirt so tightly I could feel her fingernails through the fabric. The drive to the emergency room took 12 minutes, and I spent every one of them replaying the scene in my parents' living room, trying to understand how people who claimed to love us could be so indifferent to genuine suffering. The ER doctor, Dr. Patterson, took one look at Zara's leg and immediately ordered x-rays. The break was clean but significant. Both the tibia and fibula were fractured. She'd need surgery to set the bones properly and would be in a cast for at least 8 weeks. When he asked what had happened, I found myself downplaying the family drama and focusing on the tree branch. But his next question stopped me cold. "How long was she walking on this injury before you brought her in?" "She wasn't," I said quickly. "I brought her straight here." But as I sat in that sterile waiting room while Zara was in surgery, a memory surfaced that I'd buried for 20 years. I was 9, maybe 10, and I'd fallen off my bike hard enough to knock the wind out of me. My wrist was throbbing, clearly sprained, but when I came inside crying, my father had made me sit at the kitchen table until I stopped. No ice, no comfort, just the expectation that I would suffer silently until I learned to be stronger. I'd forgotten that day completely, along with dozens of others like it. The pattern of minimizing pain, of treating medical needs as character flaws, of demanding that children bear adult levels of stoicism. I'd grown up thinking that was normal, even admirable. But watching my own daughter go through what I'd endured, I finally saw it for what it was, abuse disguised as toughness. The plan came to me during Zara's second week in the cast, when I was helping her navigate the stairs in our house. She'd adapted to the crutches with typical 7-year-old determination, but I could see how much harder everything had become for her. Getting dressed, taking baths, even sleeping, the injury had disrupted her entire world. And my family still hadn't called to check on her. That's when I remembered something from my work at the hospital. Our department kept detailed records of every case, including notes about delayed treatment and its consequences. I'd seen children come in with injuries that could have been minor if treated immediately, but had become serious because parents waited too long or tried to handle things themselves. I started documenting everything. The exact time of Zara's fall, the visible symptoms I'd observed, the specific words my parents and Marcus had used to dismiss her injury. I wrote down every detail I could remember, including their refusal to help transport her to the hospital. Then I did something that felt both necessary and terrible. I started recording our family interactions. My first attempt was clumsy. I tried to bring up Zara's injury during a family dinner, hoping to get them to admit they'd made a mistake. Instead, my mother doubled down, insisting that I was raising Zara to be fragile and that missing a few hours before treatment wouldn't have made any real difference. The conversation was awkward, forced. I realized I needed to be more subtle, more strategic. Over the next few weeks, I visited more often, always with my phone's voice recorder running. I learned to steer conversations toward their parenting philosophy, their views on modern medicine, their belief that children today were coddled compared to their generation. What I discovered was worse than I'd expected. This wasn't just about Zara's broken leg. They had a systematic contempt for what they called weakness, a genuine belief that children should endure pain without complaint. They talked about it like a virtue, a lost art of building character through suffering. I had all the evidence I needed. The question was what to do with it. The family reunion was my father's idea, a celebration of his 75th birthday that would bring together cousins, aunts, and uncles I hadn't seen in years. He wanted it held at the community center where he'd served on the board for 2 decades, a place where his reputation as a pillar of the community was unquestioned. The irony was perfect. I arrived early with a small gift, a digital photo frame loaded with family pictures spanning 5 decades. But I'd made some additions to the slideshow that weren't immediately obvious. Mixed in with birthday parties and holiday gatherings were screenshots of text messages, timestamps from hospital records, and audio transcripts of conversations I'd recorded over the past month. The presentation started normally enough. Pictures of my father as a young man, his wedding to my mother, Marcus, and me as children. Everyone smiled and reminisced. Then the first message appeared on screen, a text thread between Marcus and his girlfriend where he mocked Zara's injury and called me a hysteric for rushing her to the ER. The room went quiet, but people weren't sure what they were seeing. The pictures kept cycling. Family barbecues. Christmas mornings. Then a hospital discharge summary showing Zara's fracture and the note about delayed treatment. More family photos. Then an audio transcript of my mother saying that children who cry over injuries are being manipulated by overprotective parents. I watched my father's face as the room slowly realized what was happening. His jaw tightened, his hands gripped the edge of his chair, but he couldn't stop the slideshow without making a scene. Every few slides, another piece of evidence appeared. His own voice saying that doctors were money-hungry vultures who convinced parents that normal childhood bumps needed medical attention. By the time the slideshow ended, 43 relatives had seen exactly who my parents really were. Not the wise, loving grandparents they pretended to be in public, but people who would let a child suffer rather than admit they might be wrong. People who had raised their own children to believe that pain was weakness and medical care was indulgence. The silence in that room was everything I'd hoped for. The fallout was swift and thorough. My Aunt Patricia, who'd always looked up to my father, left the party without speaking to him. Cousins who had trusted my parents to babysit their own children suddenly remembered urgent reasons to leave early. The community center board members who were there began asking quiet questions about my father's judgment and character. Within a week, 3 different relatives had called me to apologize for not seeing the pattern sooner. My cousin Jennifer, who was a social worker, said she'd always felt uncomfortable with how my parents talked about children, but had convinced herself it was just generational differences. Now she was wondering about her own childhood memories, re-examining moments she'd dismissed or forgotten. The hardest part was explaining everything to Zara. She was old enough to understand that Grandma and Grandpa had made a mistake, but young enough to be confused about why that meant we couldn't visit them anymore. I found myself having conversations about boundaries and self-protection that I'd never imagined having with a 7-year-old. But something unexpected happened during those conversations. Zara started talking about other times she'd felt dismissed or uncomfortable at my parents' house, small incidents I'd missed or rationalized. The time my father had yelled at her for crying when she'd pinched her finger in a drawer. The way my mother would criticize her for being sensitive whenever she got her feelings hurt. I realized I'd been so focused on maintaining family relationships that I'd missed how those relationships were affecting my daughter. The physical injury from the tree branch would heal completely, but the emotional damage of being taught that her pain didn't matter could have lasted forever. Sitting in our living room one evening, watching her practice walking without crutches, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the solid satisfaction of choosing my child's well-being over everyone else's comfort. 6 months later, Zara's cast was long gone, but the lessons from that day have stayed with both of us. She's learned that her instincts about pain, physical and emotional, deserve to be trusted. I've learned that family isn't defined by DNA, but by who shows up when showing up matters most. The relatives who reached out after the reunion have become our chosen family now. They understand that loving children means believing them when they're hurt, protecting them even when it's inconvenient, and never using their pain as a teaching tool about toughness. My parents still live 3 blocks away, but they might as well be on another planet. Sometimes I see my father at the grocery store, and he looks smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his own choices. Marcus moved out of their house last month, apparently. Living with the consequences of his character wasn't as comfortable as living without them. The tree in their backyard is still there, the broken branch long since removed. But I drive past it differently now, seeing it not as the site of an accident, but as the place where I finally learned the difference between family and people who just happen to be related to you. Sometimes the most important lesson is knowing when to walk away.